1944, Iowa. The evening air carried the sweetness of cut grass and the sharper scent of coal smoke from the kitchen stoves. Inside the camp's dining hall, a line of German women shuffled forward under the watchful gaze of American guards. The light came from bare bulbs, humming faintly overhead, and the room smelled of coffee, white bread, and something unfamiliar, rich, nutty, almost sweet. On the counter, cooks laid out trays of sliced bread. Not the heavy, gray loaves of wartime Germany, but soft, white slices that bent under the fingers. Each piece was spread with a thick brown paste that gleamed under the lamps. To the American eye, it was ordinary, peanut butter, a staple so common it hardly bore mention. But to the women standing in line, it was alien. They whispered to one another in German. "It is not butter. It is not jam. It smells strange. Like roasted beans." Suspicion creased their faces. War had trained them to distrust surprises, and this food seemed like another trick, another humiliation. One guard, years later, wrote in his report, "They stared at the sandwiches as if we had laid down weapons. They expected ration slop, boiled potatoes, maybe stale bread. What they received was something none of them could name." The line moved. Plates clattered. At the tables, the women sat stiffly, their eyes fixed on the bread before them. No one moved to eat. The room filled with silence, an unnatural quiet in a place usually loud with scraping chairs and muttered voices. At last, one woman, perhaps the youngest, dared. She raised the slice, studied it, then took a cautious bite. Her jaw worked once, twice, and then she froze. Her eyes widened. She looked not at the guards, not at her companions, but into some private distance. For a second, her face was unreadable. Then came the reaction, a laugh, sharp and incredulous, bursting from her throat. The sound broke the room. Another woman followed, nibbling, then gasping softly. Her lips trembled, and tears welled in her eyes. She bent her head, hiding her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Across the hall, others began tasting, their expressions swinging wildly, confusion, delight, shame. Some chewed slowly, as though testing whether the sweetness might vanish if savored too quickly. The guards watched with a mixture of curiosity and unease. To them, peanut butter was childhood. Lunchboxes, picnics, mornings before school. They had never considered it exotic. Yet here it was, acting like a weapon more powerful than any interrogation room. One officer of the camp later recalled, "We thought of America in terms of tanks and planes." But that night, what reached them first was a spoonful of paste on a slice of bread. And it shook them more than the sight of any rifle. The contrast was brutal. These women had expected punishment, harsh rations, reminders of their captivity. Instead, they were handed a luxury so mundane to Americans it was almost invisible. For the prisoners, raised in a world of scarcity and propaganda, it was an impossible contrast, their homeland, rationing ersatz coffee brewed from acorns, bread stretched with potato starch, meat reserved for the front, and here, in the country of their enemy, white bread spread thick with a product made not for survival but for comfort. The silence after the first bites was heavier than any command. Some women kept eating quickly, as if afraid the gift would be snatched away. Others left their plates untouched, staring down at them with tight jaws, unwilling to yield. One muttered bitterly, "If they can give this to us, their prisoners, what must they give their children?" The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into deep water. It was not only food. It was revelation. In that small, windowless hall, the women glimpsed another reality, one where abundance was ordinary, where sweetness could be spread thick on bread without thought of ration cards or shortages. It was both miracle and humiliation, comfort and insult. An American guard wrote in his notebook that night, "I had seen prisoners endure questions, searches, long marches. They were strong. But here, a sandwich broke them. I don't know what it meant, but I know I saw it happen." For some, the taste became memory on the tongue, something they would carry long after barbed wire and guard towers faded. For others, it cut deep, a reminder of what their loyalty to the Reich had cost them and their families. In the corner of the hall, one woman sat unmoving, bread untouched, lips pressed white. When asked later why, she answered only, "Because I cannot let them show me what we have lost." The record of that evening remains in camp files, a curious entry among reports of discipline and supply. It is brief, but the sentence carries more weight than pages of orders. At supper, the prisoners encountered peanut butter. Their reactions were unexpected. It was their first encounter with peanut butter. And it struck harder than any order or interrogation. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Autumn 1944. The Iowa air turned crisp, evenings settling early with the smell of harvested cornfields drifting through the camp fences. In the women's barracks, the light came from a single stove, its heat barely enough to cut the chill. Supper had ended an hour before, yet the silence lingered. They were not speaking about the war, nor about home, but about what had been laid before them at the tables. A journal kept by one prisoner preserves the moment. "I had believed America was only bombs and soldiers. Now I know the taste of something we never had at home, and never will. I cannot stop thinking of it." It was not a weapon, nor a machine. It was the thick, brown spread that had been served again, paired with white bread and coffee strong enough to sting the tongue. The women sat on their bunks afterward, trying to describe it to one another. Some groped for comparisons, like nuts, like oil, like sweet butter, but not butter. Others simply shook their heads, baffled that such food could exist. Then came the remark that silenced the room. A middle-aged mother of two, hair pulled tight beneath her kerchief, said softly, "If they can afford to give this even to us, their enemies, imagine what their children eat." The words cut deeper than any guard's command. For a moment no one moved. The stove hissed. Outside, a dog barked at the fence line. Then one of the younger women began to weep quietly, pulling a blanket to her face. The effect was unmistakable. What had seemed a curiosity became something else, proof of a gap between worlds. In Germany, coffee came from roasted acorns, bread was stretched with potato flour, fat rationed into near invisibility. Here, prisoners ate food that felt like luxury, offered without calculation, without ration cards. An American guard later admitted in a letter home, "They looked at us as if we'd shown them a trick. But it wasn't a trick, it was just lunch." I realized then they weren't just fighting us as soldiers. They were fighting the idea that our lives ran on plenty while theirs had been pared to the bone. The cultural shock rattled even the hardest. One woman, who had carried herself with military stiffness since her capture, confessed under her breath that night, "It humiliates me, that taste. Because I cannot deny it is good." Others reacted with defiance, calling it decadent, swearing they would not touch it again. But the memory of the flavor lingered regardless. Arguments flared. Some claimed the Americans used food as propaganda, a way to undermine morale without firing a shot. Others disagreed. "They do not even notice it," whispered one prisoner. "To them it is ordinary. That is the insult, we matter so little they give us what they have in their kitchens at home." The contrast grew sharper when news seeped in, through rumors and intercepted letters, of conditions in Germany. Families living on meager rations. Children sharing crusts of dark bread baked with fillers. Ersatz coffee, bitter and thin, passed around like medicine. The thought that across the ocean children in Iowa spread thick layers of peanut butter on fresh white bread was more than shocking, it was unbearable. Some women clung to anger as defense. "This is their weakness," one insisted. "They drown themselves in fat and sugar. That is why we fight them. Discipline is strength, not indulgence." But even she hesitated when the next supper brought another plate of sandwiches, her hand lingering before pushing it away. The Americans never spoke of it. To them, it was just another ration item. They could not see how it cracked open certainties built by years of propaganda. For the prisoners, though, it became impossible to ignore. If the enemy had so much that even his captives ate better than the families of soldiers back home, what did that say about the war? One guard recorded in the daily log that week, prisoners appeared subdued. No incidents, but mood strange, quiet, almost reverent. He could not know that the silence masked turmoil, a reckoning none dared speak aloud. Later, one of the women wrote secretly in a notebook hidden under her bunk, "It is not the taste itself. It is what it means, that they live in a world we cannot imagine, a world of comfort so ordinary they do not notice it. To us it feels like a miracle, and to them it is nothing." The barracks fell quiet again, each woman left alone with the same unspoken thought. For some it was wonder, for others humiliation. But all felt the weight of a new truth: America lived in another reality altogether. And in that silence, another question began to grow, dangerous, sharp, impossible to suppress. If this is what their enemies eat in captivity, what exactly had Germany been fighting for? Winter 1944-45. The Iowa winds howled across the prairie, cutting through the barbed wire like knives. Snow clung to the roofs of the barracks, melting only where stovepipes pushed out weak curls of smoke. Inside, the air was dry and cold enough to sting the nose. Blankets were thin, bunks crowded. But in the dining hall, warmth lingered, a coal stove glowing red, the smell of coffee and bread spreading across the long wooden tables. That night, the meal seemed ordinary to the Americans who served it: white bread, butter, stew, and once again, the thick brown paste that had slowly become routine. Peanut butter was there on the counter, ladled without thought. For the prisoners, it still carried weight far beyond nutrition. An American Army doctor, assigned to the camp, wrote afterward, "I observed several of the women crying during supper. When I asked if something was wrong, one replied only that the taste of the butter reminded her of all they had been denied at home. It was not poison in her stomach, but a wound in her memory." At another table, a guard kept his eyes fixed on the women. He later described it in a letter home: "I have seen tough prisoners, ones who wouldn't flinch at questioning. But I watched them break down over a sandwich. It wasn't hunger, it was the shock of it. They were not beaten by chains or threats. They were undone by bread and spread." The women tried to compose themselves, but emotion rolled through the hall in waves. One young prisoner pressed her sleeve to her eyes and whispered, "It is sweet. Too sweet." Another kept chewing with mechanical rhythm, but tears slipped freely down her cheeks. At the far end of the table, a woman pushed her plate away, jaw tight, her face rigid with pride, but her hands trembled as if the restraint cost more than surrender. For the Americans, it was a baffling sight. For the women, it was a private reckoning. That taste, the oil, the sweetness, the abundance in every bite, was a mirror held up to their war-torn lives. In Germany, ration books grew thinner each month. Children scraped bowls of turnip soup, women queued for hours for bread that crumbled dry, their coffee brewed from ground acorns. Now, here, in the heart of their enemy's land, captives ate food better than what their own children might have at home. The propaganda of the Reich had promised strength through sacrifice, discipline, endurance. It painted America as soft, decadent, a land without will. But the reality in that dining hall cut through the slogans. Strength was not in scarcity. Power was not in empty plates. Here was strength measured in abundance, a society so wealthy it could afford to feed its prisoners as well as its citizens. The contrast was unbearable. For years these women had told themselves they fought for a future worth the suffering. But with every mouthful, that conviction cracked. What future could Germany truly promise if even captivity in America felt richer than life at home? A diary entry from one prisoner survives, its ink blurred by moisture. "Tonight I cried. Not for hunger, not for fear. I cried because I tasted something I could never give my children. I wonder now if our sacrifice has always been for nothing." The camp staff noticed the silence afterward. Usually, meals ended with the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of boots, the murmur of voices returning to barracks. That night the women filed out wordlessly, faces drawn, eyes lowered. Even the guards felt the weight of it. One recorded in the logbook: prisoners appear unsettled. Cause unknown. Possibly food. The note was curt, blind to the storm raging beneath the surface. Later that week, the same pattern repeated. Each time the sandwiches appeared, emotions followed, laughter that cracked into sobs, whispered confessions quickly silenced, moments when even hardened captives dropped their masks. And yet, resistance remained. In one barrack, an older woman scolded her companions for weakness: "Do not let them win with food. That is how they humiliate us." Her words carried steel, but the silence that followed revealed doubt. The others stared at the floor, unwilling to argue, yet unable to forget the taste. For the women, the butter became more than food. It was a symbol, one they could neither accept nor reject. To embrace it meant admitting the life they had believed in was smaller, poorer, perhaps even built on lies. To refuse it meant acknowledging that they feared its truth. Snow fell harder that month, blanketing the camp in white silence. Inside the barracks, the women lay awake under thin covers, haunted not by interrogation or propaganda, but by the flavor of something they could not erase. It was not hunger that tormented them, it was comparison. And in the stillness, a question rose, silent but insistent: had their war, their loyalty, their sacrifices stolen from them and their children a future that smelled of fresh bread and tasted of peanut butter? Spring 1945. The war in Europe was stumbling toward its end, though behind the barbed wire of Iowa the news came only in fragments, rumors carried by guards, headlines glimpsed in discarded newspapers. In the women's barracks, the air was heavy with waiting. Nights stretched long, filled with the low hum of the single bulb that swung above the tables. Shadows climbed the wooden walls as women whispered, voices sharp or trembling, depending on which side of a new divide they stood. The divide was not over politics or battles. It was over food. What had begun months earlier as a shock, the strange, nutty spread on white bread, had now become something else. Some of the women had started to treat the sandwiches as prizes, slipping halves into their coats, sharing small pieces in secret like contraband sweets. They whispered about the taste in tones half guilty, half longing. Others reacted with fury. One night, when a woman unwrapped a saved sandwich under her blanket, the hiss of disapproval cut through the room. "You disgrace Germany when you smile at their food," another spat, her accent sharp, her eyes hard with conviction. "Do you not see what they are doing? They feed us like children, and you laugh. You betray your own." Arguments flared in low tones, escalating to shouts. Some women wept, insisting it was not betrayal to be hungry, not treason to enjoy what was given. "We are prisoners, not machines," one snapped back. "If we must suffer, what is the point of refusing a piece of bread?" The insults cut deep. In camp slang, a new word took shape: the Americans. It was used bitterly, not for the guards, but for their fellow prisoners who had begun to praise the food, the clothing, even the strange abundance of the enemy's world. To be called an American inside the barracks was to be marked as suspect, accused of weakness, of surrender. An archival report captures the tension: among the prisoners there has developed hostility toward those perceived as friendly to American ways. The term Amerikanerinen has been applied, not without venom. The irony was sharp. Food, which in theory should have united them, keeping them alive, easing their captivity, was now the wedge that split them. A few women guarded their crusts of white bread like treasures, savoring every bite. Others refused entirely, sitting rigid with folded arms, watching with scorn as companions chewed. One guard later recalled the atmosphere: it was not the Germans against us anymore. It was the Germans against each other. At night you could hear them arguing long after lights out. The food had become a battlefield. The conflict was not just about taste. It was about identity. To admit the food was good was to admit the Reich's story of American weakness was false. To refuse it was to cling desperately to the image of loyalty, even as Germany itself crumbled thousands of miles away. Spring storms rattled the barrack roofs. Rain ran in thin streams down the windowpanes, blurring the view of the fences beyond. Inside, the women divided themselves in subtle lines: who sat with whom, who whispered together, who avoided whose gaze. Peanut butter was no longer just a curiosity, it was a measure of allegiance. One prisoner confided in her journal, "We do not speak of the war anymore. We speak of bread and the strange brown butter. Some women love it, some hate it, but in truth, it is not the food we argue about. It is what it says about us, about what we have believed." That truth hung heavy in the air. Every bite was a test. Every refusal, a declaration. And so the nights filled with quiet skirmishes, angry words in the dark, stolen sandwiches traded like currency, suspicious glances exchanged over tin cups of coffee. The guards, for all their authority, could not police this war. It raged silently, invisibly, beneath the roof of every barrack. In the official record, little remains but a line in a camp log, morale unstable. Internal divisions noted. The report reads like routine, but behind it lay nights of whispered accusations, of women turning against one another, of friendships eroded by something as small as a spoonful of spread on bread. In those barracks, the great war of nations was mirrored in miniature. Not fought with rifles or artillery, but with suspicion, hunger, pride, and longing. And the battle line was drawn across the simplest of things, whether to take a bite, or to push the plate away. In these barracks, an invisible war raged. A war between the past they had been forced to believe in, and the present they saw with their own eyes. Summer 1945. The war in Europe was over, though the barbed wire still ringed the Iowa camp. The sun beat down on the wooden roofs until the air inside the barracks grew stifling, the boards hot to the touch. Flies gathered at the windows. The days stretched long, quiet, broken only by the scratch of pencils against paper. For the women, writing letters had become a ritual. Some wrote to husbands whose fate was uncertain, others to parents in ruined cities, others still to children they had not seen in years. The Red Cross provided stationery, thin sheets stamped with the lines of censors. They knew their words would be read, crossed out, sometimes confiscated. Yet they wrote anyway, as if the act itself was survival. One of those letters, never delivered, remains in the archive. "I tasted something here I never knew before. It was strange and wonderful. I do not know if I will ever taste it again, but I cannot forget it." The writer did not name the food. She did not need to. The American censor, reading the words, underlined the passage in red and pulled the sheet aside. To him, it was too revealing, too intimate a confession of weakness to be sent across the ocean. Another letter, equally fragile, carried a different tone. "I believed our enemies to be cruel. I imagined their land as cold and ruthless. But they gave me bread, white bread, and butter made from nuts. Is this not true power, that even to those they call enemies, they give more than our leaders gave us?" That letter, too, was stopped. The censors allowed through only neutral reports. "We are in good health. The weather is hot. We are treated fairly." Everything else was withheld, stacked into files that would remain sealed for decades. The women never knew which words reached their families and which were swallowed by bureaucracy. They wrote of longing, of shame, of bewilderment, but when responses came, months later, sometimes never at all, they were stiff, formal, stripped of intimacy. Families in Germany still spoke the language of propaganda: "Be strong. Endure. The Führer lives in our hearts." The contrast was painful. In the camp, they whispered about the letters that had been confiscated. One woman admitted hers had been returned with half the page blacked out. Another said she had written of peanut butter only to see the line erased in ink so thick the paper tore. They began to realize that their truest confessions were not traveling home at all, they were being captured here, locked into American archives. A guard remembered the sight of them at the long tables, bent over their pages, the sound of graphite scratching like a chorus. It was not war plans they wrote, not secrets. It was feelings. But in a way, feelings were more dangerous. Those letters told truths their own government never admitted. The truths varied. Some expressed gratitude, confused but undeniable. "I never thought kindness could come from this side." Others wrote with bitterness at their own leaders. They told us America was weak. I see now that we were the ones starved into obedience while they lived well. Still others wrote with sorrow, trying to reconcile what they had tasted with what their children endured back home. The camp logs note that censorship intensified in the months after Germany's surrender. More letters were stopped. The official explanation was that unauthorized content threatened morale in occupied zones. But in truth, it was because the words revealed something larger than military secrets. They revealed doubt. They revealed envy. They revealed the quiet acknowledgement that America, their enemy, had offered them a glimpse of a world their homeland had promised but never delivered. By August, the habit of writing had become almost futile. The women continued, but many folded their pages knowing they might never be read. They wrote for themselves, for the relief of putting ink to paper, for the chance to confess to someone, even if that someone was only a censor with a rubber stamp. One of the most haunting lines comes from an intercepted note: perhaps the true defeat is not in losing battles, but in realizing that the life we were told to hate is better than the life we were told to love. That page, too, never crossed the ocean. The women never knew. They waited for answers that never came, for words from families who could not imagine what had happened inside the wire. For them, the silence was heavy, but not unusual. They assumed the chaos of the Reich's collapse had swallowed their mail. In reality, those letters lay locked in cabinets, silent witnesses of how war breaks people not only with bullets, but with revelations. These letters never reached Germany. But they remain in archives, fragile paper carrying the quiet testimony that war shatters not only bodies and cities. It shatters certainties. 1946, the gates of the Iowa camp finally opened. The barbed wire, rusted by Midwestern winters, stood useless as groups of women filed out, carrying what little they had gathered during captivity: wool blankets, tin cups, folded letters never mailed. American trucks took them to trains bound east. Their journey home was long, across fields that stretched without end. Some pressed their faces to the windows, staring at barns, silos, endless corn. Others sat rigid, hands folded in laps, eyes unfocused. For years they had dreamed of this day, of freedom. But the closer they came to Europe, the more uncertain that word became. When they reached Germany, freedom revealed itself in ruins. The cities they had once known were unrecognizable. Hamburg was a maze of craters. Cologne's cathedral stood blackened but alone amid a desert of rubble. In Frankfurt, entire neighborhoods had collapsed into heaps of stone and twisted iron. Train stations stank of soot, mud, and bodies long buried under masonry. Children played barefoot in broken streets, their laughter thin and desperate. A former prisoner remembered the first shock of stepping into her old street, where my house had stood was nothing but an outline of bricks. I thought, in America, even as captives, we were given bread still warm from ovens. Here, in my homeland, I saw women scraping for crusts among ruins. Food dominated every thought. In the camps, they had eaten white bread, stew, fruit when supplies allowed. It had seemed simple to the guards, but to the prisoners it was extraordinary. In Germany, even after surrender, hunger was a tyrant. Ration cards promised little: dark bread bulked with fillers, watery soups of turnip and cabbage, bitter coffee made from acorns. Families queued for hours for a handful of potatoes, often to find the stall already empty. Another woman later testified, "I stood in the rubble of Hamburg and thought of that strange nut butter the Americans gave us. At the time, I did not understand it. Now, when I see my neighbors boiling weeds for soup, I realize it was abundance beyond our imagination." They tried to explain what they had seen. One spoke of white bread so soft it bent at the touch, of thick brown paste spread in generous layers. Neighbors laughed. Butter from nuts? Ridiculous. You invent fairy tales. She insisted, but the others shook their heads. To those who had never left Germany, such stories sounded like madness, a trick memory. Some prisoners stopped speaking of it altogether. Others whispered in kitchens, confessing that they still remembered the taste. One woman wrote in her diary, it is not hunger that torments me now, but memory. I dream of the sweetness. I despise myself for longing for it, but longing does not stop. The contrast was more than physical, it was ideological. For years they had been told America was weak, soft, drowning in excess. Germany, they were told, was disciplined, hardened, destined to rule. But what they had seen in captivity inverted everything. In America, abundance was ordinary, so plentiful it was extended even to enemies. In Germany, greatness had collapsed into hunger. One recalled a moment of clarity, we had been told we were the strong ones. But in the camp, I understood, strength was not in going without. Strength was in being able to give, even to a prisoner. Back in their homeland, surrounded by ruins, they carried these memories like contraband. Some felt shame, how could they admit that the enemy had shown them kindness their own state had denied? Others clung to the memory secretly, a proof that life could be different, that another world existed. One woman, returning to Frankfurt, described trying to tell her neighbors about the food. I told them of milk, of fruit, of the sandwiches. They accused me of exaggeration. They laughed at peanut butter, called it an invention. I fell silent. But inside I knew, I had seen another reality. Once you have seen it, you cannot go back to blindness. By 1946, these women dissolved into the wreckage of post-war Germany. Some found husbands among returning soldiers, some searched in vain for families lost in bombings, some drifted through refugee lines with children clinging to their skirts. Yet each carried the same ghost, the memory of a simple sandwich that had stripped away certainty more effectively than any bullet. For some, it became nostalgia. For others, humiliation. But for all, it was proof of what the war had stolen, not just lives and cities, but the possibility of a future where a child could know abundance without shame. An American historian later described it coldly, they expected chains. They prepared for interrogations. Instead, they were undone by a taste. And that was the lasting truth. The women had braced themselves for cruelty, for punishment. Instead, they were confronted with a reality more devastating, their enemy fed them better in captivity than their homeland had in freedom. The real defeat did not come with the fall of Berlin, nor with signatures on surrender documents. It came quietly, in a dining hall far from the front, where a piece of white bread carried more power than a uniform or a flag. They had expected pain, humiliation, even torture. What broke them was a taste. Because sometimes the deepest defeat does not come on the battlefield. It comes at the dinner table,